Our next panel is on the intersections of the arts and civil rights. For our moderator, we have Roberto Trevino, inaugural executive director of the San Antonio Philharmonic. He's also someone who has been a longtime supporter of MACRI. When we were founded in 2019, he was part of the city council that approved our seed funding, and he was one of the big supporters. So thank you so much, Roberto, for that, for always being an advocate for the arts. And I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce the rest of the panelists.
Thank you. Oh, is this on? Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Sara, for all that you do and putting on this incredible symposium. I'm honored to be a part of this great subject regarding arts and civil rights. As she mentioned, I represent the San Antonio Philharmonic as their executive director. I just want to say a little bit about our organization and why I think I'm up here is because much of you have heard of the different aspects of what the symphony has meant here in San Antonio, but the evolution that has now become the Philharmonic, and what we are focusing much of our values on is this idea that we're really about the community, this community in particular, and it's steeped in issues like civil rights and what the arts means to support these notions, these ideas of fairness and equality. I want to acknowledge that our board chair from the San Antonio Philharmonic, Brian Petkovich, is here. He's a true hero of this community. He's also a musician of the Philharmonic. And so the biggest change of the Philharmonic is that it's run by the musicians. This is a truly musician-led effort. We're headquartered on the west side, and we're focusing, again, as I mentioned, on the community and community values. And so with that, I want to go ahead and get started on this topic. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists, Claudia Zapata, the Blanton Museum's first Associate Curator of Latino Art. We also have Mia Lopez of the McNay Art Museum, and of course, Marc, David Pinate of the Borderlands Theater. So again, what I'd like to start off with is the very first question about, just to get your perspective, and we'll take whatever order you'd like to start in, is your perspective on arts and civil rights and how it was in the past as you recognize it, and how it is today. How has it evolved? What's remained? What's constant? And what is it you see can be an improvement?
Sure. I'll start the conversation. So I specialize in political prints. So Chicano printmaking is completely integrated with works on paper in a larger conversation of American art. But unfortunately, institutionally, it hasn't been really acquired as such. It's been put in archives or history centers or libraries. It hasn't been designated as fine art. And this is because of its political affiliation. It's seen as political art, a political ephemera. Oftentimes, art critics tell artists to throw it away once it's done, so to speak. So this is something we've run into historically, and as curators and scholars, is combating these issues of the past, of this past lack of stewardship. And it's interesting when you look at a lot of the political prints because it looks as though they're commenting on issues of today. Because unfortunately, oppression is never out of style. The oppression of American imperialism continues to this day. And so several conversations about anti-Blackness, police brutality, thinking about indigenous ancestry, all of these conversations have been going on since the 60s, since the 70s, and they're continuing today. And so when we're thinking about the continuity with these works of art, a lot of these themes and issues are still present today because they've never been fixed. Racism isn't over, oppression isn't over, and solidarity across oppressed groups across the country are still working together. So several of the works look timeless because they're completely in this eye of the artist that is both activist and artist. So there's these many dual roles of the art world, specifically for Latino and Chicano art.
I think you made some excellent points, Claudia, and a great way to just jumpstart the conversation. And something that came to mind for me, you said a great phrase, oppression has never gone out of style. When I was first starting my studies as an art historian and was interested in Latino art, of course, there were very few Latino artists that were in the textbooks. Specifically, the giant survey textbooks, your Art History 101 and 102, maybe you would be lucky if there was, a reference to Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, and that would probably be it. This is early 2000s, and I want to believe that it has gotten better. But one of the things that I had to combat was, as I was starting to work in mainstream museums, there was a little bit of a feeling that because of the multiculturalism movement in the 90s, late 80s, throughout the 90s, that, okay, that was a trend, and artists of color and artists working with identity politics, they had their moment, and now it's time to move on. And I can guarantee that if you talk to any artist of color, any person that is working with identity politics, whether it's as a visual artist, a theater artist, literary, etc., their identity has not gone out of style. That was not a trend for them. It's central to the work that they do every day. And so what we are seeing now, and I am optimistic about the current state of representation in museums, particularly as it pertains to Latinos, because we're seeing now that our institutions are being forced to acknowledge it was not a trend. It did not, have a beginning and end point. We're seeing positions like Claudia's, like mine. I'm the first curator of Latinx art at the McNay. We're seeing this, these permanent roles for celebrating and doing the work, doing the deep scholarship that these subject matters require.
I just want to preface my remarks that I run a theater company in Tucson, and so a lot of I'm just going to speak from my experience, which is in theater in Southern Arizona and a little bit in California when I was younger. But certainly El Teatro Campesino probably marks the beginning of theater used as a tool for civil rights, for organizing and movimiento work. That didn't sort of exist in a vacuum. There was the Free Southern Theater, Bread and Puppet Theater. Is basically part of the alternative theater movement of the 60s. And it was a beautiful thing, as I was coming up in San Jose, California, right out of college, I hooked up with Teatro Visión and would just kind of literally sit at the feet of the teatrista veteranos, telling these tales of, traveling through Mexico in a VW van and performing in little pueblitos and, performing for their supper, basically. I think that guerrilla theater, street theater, that very political theater has the big change is that social media and digital TikTok videos and viral videos and memes, and I think a lot of what teatro was doing in the 60s and 70s was trying to educate, trying to inspire, and trying to influence people to shift their views. And so now we have influencers whose job it is just to get on their phones and put it out there, and it is hard to compete with the numbers of a viral video. And there's some really smart, funny at times, or just arresting moments that can be created, in a short video that really sort of get to people, get to your sort of hearts. And as we're seeing all the protests in the different universities right now, a lot of that is being fueled through social media. But where I think that theater remains most effective and has continued to excel is at the hyper-local. And so you see a lot of, and so it is this shift, I think, also that has gone from very highly political, voting, worker rights, things like that, to looking more at issues of health, of mental health, of community, what they call social cohesion. Theater artists, because we're basically storytellers, we go in and we can listen. At Borderlands Theater, we collect a lot of oral histories. We work in historic barrios that are being gentrified. And we talk to the elders, and we get all those stories of what things were like back in the old days. And there's so much heritage practices that are really important and, go back to our indigenous roots. And they're often taken for granted because they're just ubiquitous, right? They're a pot of beans, big deal. But as you start talking to people from different areas, there's about 10 ways to make a pot of beans, and it really depends on what the occasion is. And so it gets very, you start talking to folklorists, and I've had the good fortune to, study under some amazing folklorists. And when you get into ethnographies, and then the job of the theater artist is through costume, through spectacle, and through great acting, right? That brings that human element in a way that a screen can never do. But of course, it's going to just affect the people right there. But there is a lot to be said to be just a few feet away from a story that is so compelling and is being told with, pure corazón, and that you relate to. And so, working with communities to help them come together, to feel a sense of belonging, to be able to make group decisions that affect their neighborhoods, to find the confidence because you see that you are actually, my history goes back a long time in this place, to talk to city council members, to call your city council member. To me, this is sort of at that smaller local level where I think theater has really taken off.
Great comments, Marc. And I think some of us know a few city council members we can contact to make those points. In fact, I think the common theme that I heard here was one of representation, right? So I think the next question I want to ask is when it comes to representation, whether it's, as you mentioned, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, it's seeing artists and arts on the walls, but what about also making sure that the institutions themselves, the administration, management, I'm the first Hispanic executive director of this symphony here locally, and I in fact, I can't find another one currently in the United States that has one as well. And so there's a lot of firsts, but how do we address this? How do we grow boards and administration to also be supportive of these efforts so that we can ensure that they're really embedded as part of our institutions?
There's issues of capitalism that you just can't get around, and there's this kind of nihilistic overview of thinking about the nonprofit industrial complex and thinking about the issues of its structure and the issues of the history of museums, because you're beholden to a very specific 1% in terms of who's dictating overall the vision of the institution, and that has a complete effect in terms of acquisition, staffing. It's one thing to have termed funding and positions that are supported by foundations for a couple of years. There's always these fellowships or internships or initiatives that are short-lived, that are grant-based, and so it's seen as just enough. But really, you need to think about these larger systems of financial organization for these institutions, because the 1% isn't going to help you. The 1% isn't going to save the world, but you're still relying on that structure. So there's this tension that will always exist based on the foundation of the institution itself, specifically for museums and several other types of organizations where you're dealing with a board or trustees. And the issue is when you're looking at diversity and you're thinking about how diverse is your staff, that's one thing, but how diverse are your trustees and your board members? That's really what will dictate change. And how are you cultivating, if you want it to be a more diverse makeup for your institution, what are the steps? And this is the issue with developing this next stage, specifically in the arts, is developing this next stage of Latino change makers, is that it's not just in the curatorial space, it's in development, it's in marketing, because all of those spaces and all of those staff, that cultural nuance can make or break certain productions, certain exhibitions, when you're challenging a marketing person as to why you're saying Chicano versus Hispanic, or Mexican American versus Latinx. And that cultural nuance and that cultural training that isn't required at several different positions besides curatorial, for example, in the case of museums, there's this lack of general cultural consciousness at all these levels that nonprofits and the art spaces need. In addition to a curator or content specialist, you need a trustee and you need a board member who understands these larger motivations of the communities that they represent and that the institution is trying to reach if they haven't already. And oftentimes, this is done through a consulting firm temporarily for temporary productions that maybe the Latino community wants to see. And there's this presumption as to what the Latino community wants to see. And it's usually culturally based, Mexico-specific kind of content. But in reality, all content is open to the Latino communities if you know how to reach to them. So these are the issues. I'm giving you answers. No, I'm giving mainly problems, but this is something to consider, that you are going up against this fundamentally flawed structure that is a larger representation of capitalism and the issues around that, and that daily kind of, okay, well, what are we going to do? We're not going to solve that, but how can we think about that when we're developing the next stage for a new vision for the institution?
I certainly am not going to try to start, giving you solutions for all of the, many issues that we are all facing in our respective, fields. But, to Claudia's point, there are so many there's complexities, right, and so many different points that need to be addressed. And I think that something that I've become more and more aware of throughout my career is the need for really a multifaceted approach, right? So yes, while on the one hand we need to think about diversifying and increasing, the diversifying our boards, diversifying our staffs, we also have to educate the people that are already there to turn people into allies, to make sure that we are not necessarily working in silos, but that we are working intersectionally, finding the commonalities with whether it's within, for museums, for instance, I'm really happy to be at an institution where a lot of the work I'm going to be doing is very collaborative. I will be working with curators that also specialize in other areas, not necessarily Latinx art. And what that hopefully will produce is exhibitions, programs, publications that have multiple perspectives. And for me, that's one way that I can do work that is both representative of my culture, my heritage, my community, but also acknowledges the way that this is part of a much broader context. The other thing, too, again, I mentioned earlier, I'm naively optimistic. My position was funded by a consortium that's Leadership in Art Museums. And this was the result of years and years of studies about demographics of museum workers, and specifically within the curatorial field. In terms of representation, it's been abysmal. Very few people of color as curators at all, let alone in kind of more leadership roles. And there's so many reasons for that. I mean, essentially, institutionalized racism really makes it difficult for people to want to stay in fields where they do not feel supported or represented. And so the Alice Walton Foundation, Ford Foundation, Mellon Foundation, and Pilot House Philanthropy came together, looked at this, and they created funding for 5 different positions around the United States. There's more to come, I'm sure. They're continuing to do the work, but it's kind of one step forward in sort of acknowledging that, yes, while we do try to make systemic change, believe me, I'm all about being the change from within, but it's also sometimes that outside help, that can kind of circumvent, okay, we have to go to the board. It can take years to create new positions. They have swooped in and said, here's, an instant, way to find a good candidate and to bring them into your institution. It is by no means a cure-all, but it's also not a Band-Aid. It's something hopefully that can have a lasting impact, not only at the McNay, but really in the field as a whole.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned some of these foundations like the Mellon and some of the other ones you mentioned, and I think we're going to talk about funding later. But it does kind of, in some ways boil down to money, capitalist system, distribution of wealth in this country, in the world. I was just on Wednesday at an NEA listening session, National Endowment for the Arts. Their chair, Maria Rosario Jackson, the first Black and Mexican chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, has been really trying to, speaking of representation, right, make a lot of changes. Was in February, there was a really great presentation on the connection between healthcare and arts and culture, and the way that those two are really enmeshed together in ways that I don't think your average person really considers. But also at her behest, they convened, I think there was about 15 or 20 artistic directors of theaters of color. And time again, about half of us didn't own a theater. We didn't have a building. 30, 40 years old. Borderlands is 38 years old. Still don't own a building. Understaffed and just really trying to make $1 out of 15 cents constantly, right? As I'm listening and around the country, and it's the exact same story, and it's really it took about 500 years, right, for the systems of the monetary, the economics that were they were put in place. There was displacement of indigenous peoples. There was slavery. There was all these things in giant ways and in individual ways that money was moved to a certain part of the population. And as far as the arts go, that's your funders. It's the rich people, the wealthy. And it is difficult. In the last panel, there was this real dichotomy between, infiltrating the mainstream or starting your own thing. I think I've given up on trying to, not that that's just my choice. I think definitely need people in mainstream institutions. But I just, it's difficult for me to imagine, giving up that power, because with wealth comes the power. And I don't know if it's in our human nature to just give that away, right? We tend to want to keep that. Because, my kids, I want them to have a better life than I had. That's just human nature. And so I think we do need to really fight for that. And luckily, I do think there's some really big funders coming in lately. And some other great, like the National New Play Network is pretty much the major sort of new play incubator in the country. And about 3 or 4 years ago, they made a pledge to make 50% or more of their board people of color. And my partner was a part of that restructuring. And I have seen a lot of, and they were successful in doing that, and they did a lot of DEI training. And so I do think there's some institutions doing that work, but not enough, not nearly enough.
Thank you, Marc. And you reminded me of Lucy Flores' quote from the last panel that was up here. I wrote it down, and she said, let's face it, sometimes we've got to build our own institutions because those institutions just don't want us. And I thought it was a very powerful quote. I wrote it down because of that. But I want to touch on the mainstream institutions, and how are they addressing sort of this growing brown nation?
So I was working at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in 2018 to 2022. And in the arts, in terms of representing, for example, Chicano art or Latinx art exhibitions, they're usually what I call eclipse shows. They happen every 20 years. And so you may get funding for that one book, and the scholarship is there, and then it's out of date 20 years later when you're patted on the head and allowed to do it again. And this is an issue of thinking about temporality and thinking about the mainstream. There's also this, whenever you're thinking about mainstream, I don't want to necessarily other the community centers and organizations that are constantly doing that work. And this is an issue with me and my position. We don't want to have this, we'll take it from here, of the community centers and the cultural centers that have been putting in that work of collecting and stewarding Latinx art and Chicano art communities since their inception. So this idea of the mainstream now allowing and acknowledging communities that always existed is very much a forced acknowledgement because it's funding based, or it's referencing specific political moments, or it's a reaction to, in the case of the arts, market value changes. And so there's still this stepped level of approval. Whenever we're going through acquisitions or we're going through reflections of who should kind of get their shot, there's always this checkpoint of, are they represented by certain galleries? Have they been through certain art fairs or Whitney biennials? Or are they collected by specific people? All of these markers of really what's white fame in the art world just do not apply for brown artists. And usually it's the case of class differentiation, of access to MFA programs, access to internships. There's all this level of privilege in the art world that one has to have in order to navigate it. And it's really time and waiting for your position or waiting for that opportunity or being able to not work and develop your practice. So this idea of acknowledging the browning of the world, we've always been here. We've always been brown. We're always there. This isn't new. We're not new. Again, we're not a trend. This isn't all of a sudden, oh, you're here. Okay, let me make room for you. No, there's money, and now we'll make room for you because you come with money. And you come with this acknowledgement of the institution or the mainstream institution now seeing as they're recognizing a trend. They're seen as diverse. It is interesting because 2020, there was this great reflection. It's like the great museum reflection is what I call it, where a lot of institutions acknowledge their desire for change, all these claims that they're going to then initiate more with BIPOC artists. And now, especially in terms of the state of Texas, all these policies where all of those statements are getting removed and erased on institutional websites. So we're kind of just going back and forth at different state levels, and at the national level, it just kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's just, you're constantly fighting the political trends of the moment that either demonize you or make you financial incentive. But the issue is that all these communities are always doing this work, and if they get acknowledged by mainstream institutions at one point or another, that's great. But don't negate the community centers that are always supporting those people. And if the mainstream, and if you're allowed in those spaces, luckily, charge them more for their artwork. Charge them more for your prices, because you are a special commodity. You are more valuable than they will ever realize.
No, that's true. I think too often these things get discounted because they're seen as given an opportunity. So great comments, Claudia.
Thank you, Claudia. I would say, yes to all of that. One of the things that, in the past, it used to be that, your mainstream institutions got away with a lot of pandering. And what I'm talking about is, these superficial gestures. It's the once every 20 years they do a Frida Kahlo exhibition, and that's all of a sudden they're doing Cinco de Mayo, they're doing having an opening with a taco truck and a mariachi band, and then that's it, and they don't really make any effort to hold on to that audience, and it's kind of a one and done. You would see things, yes, maybe something, a sentiment around Dia de los Muertos or things like that, latching on to kind of the low-hanging fruit. And now I think because of social media, because of kind of this reckoning that has been happening in the 2020s, institutions are being called out for that type of, again, very superficial lip service, and they're being, told that's not good enough. And so instead, you're having to see anybody who works at a public-facing institution really think about how do you meaningfully serve your community. And first it's, who is in your community? What are the demographics of your visitors? How is that reflective of the demographics of the place that you are in? I think it's really important that we all consider, the sites that we are working on, the histories of the people that were there before, the people that had maybe previously been excluded, and realize, that yes, there is so much work to be done, and a once in a while show is not going to be enough to really gain the trust of your audience, and also, yes, the artists who were previously excluded and went and created their own incredible institutions, and now we're, essentially a lot of these institutions are playing catch up. And so there is so much work, that we have to do, both within the actual curatorial, scholarly, art historical work of the research and the mounting of these projects and exhibitions, but also the community engagement component, the reassuring, that, our elders and our emerging artists, that we are going to do right by them. I feel fortunate that I'm at an institution that does have a long history of working with Mexican and Mexican-American artists and representation, and yet even though I have that foundation, there's still so much more work to do. There's still so much that I want to do. And so I'm grateful to be in a space like this where I can be both reminded and supported and hear, feedback and understand, yes, while there is, very much still in the middle of the struggle that, we're not alone. I have colleagues around the country that are earnestly engaging with these same questions. And, I'd say one more thing too, in terms of some of, the browning, of the field or the museums or the population, an advantage of the internet era and social media is that we can collaborate a little bit more easily, and that for me has been really nourishing in a lot of ways, to be able to keep in touch with colleagues working in New York, LA, Chicago, and to see firsthand what they're doing. Again, a reminder of just what the joy of this work can be as well.
I think in the theater, in spite of the increasing numbers of brown folks in this country, you don't really see that reflected on the stages or, by the playwrights or directors in those big houses. I believe it's 3 to 7% of acting roles, directors or writers are Latine. 3 to 7%, depending on whether you're looking at theater, TV, or film. That's and if we're 20% of the general population, right? So it's very disproportionate. And then, and I'm speaking as from the theater, but many of the Latino, Latinas that are on stage, colorism is a big deal. They tend to be very light-skinned or white-presenting Latine folks. You don't see a lot of dark, indigenous-looking Latinos like myself on these big stages. It is what's palpable for their audiences, right? So that's something that's not really discussed very much, but it's a as friends that are actors, they know that they don't get certain roles because their skin's too dark. And I think that there's, of course, there's so many theaters, and it's a case by case. And there's some theaters that are doing really great stuff, I think the Denver Center is really trying to do. They did Octavio Solis's Don Quixote for a very extended run. Lisa Portes was the director. A bunch of people I knew were in it. It was a big cast, and it got extended. And it, so there's definitely places, but then Jacob Padron took over the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven, Connecticut, a few years ago, and he realized, and sometimes when a big institution is really struggling, they may decide, oh, this is the time we're going to hire somebody of color to take over. We're going to give you this dying organization, and that was the case with him, and he's It's kind of like what happened to Obama, This homeboy, he's from Gilroy, Arizona, Gilroy, California. Garlic capital of the world. Agricultural. Migrant farm worker parents, and he went to Yale. Again, the pedigree, the privilege that you have to get to even get considered for these things, and then took over the Long Wharf. And he did this radical thing where he's like, you know what? We have this giant theater. We just can't afford to maintain it. We're gonna sell this theater, and we're gonna just present our plays throughout the city in different venues. The city is gonna be our stage. And a bunch of donors left. He got a bunch of hate mail, and people got really mad at him because again, the wealthy expect a nice plush seat. And that's what their dollars are paying for. And so it's, I decided a very long time ago, chale with the big theaters. I'm going to do my own thing. And yeah, it's always going to be rascuache. It's always going to be, I don't want to say always, because, I have hope. But it's again, what is working best for my audience, and where do they want to be, and what kind of environment can I create for us to tell our own stories. And please, if you're not from the culture, come. We welcome you with open arms and experience it authentically. But yeah, that's what I got to say.
That's wonderful. Yeah, round of applause for that. To borrow from Dr. Tomás Ibarra Frausto, the term he coined, rascuachismo, and we'll find a way to make it work because we believe in it, and it's the heart that matters. So we'll wrap it up with one last thought surrounding what is it that you are most proud of regarding how did you engage or how did you create something that you feel was the most accomplished thing you created that helped to sort of bridge that gap between arts and civil rights?
Sure. So I was a curatorial assistant on a project at Smithsonian American Art Museum, and it was an exhibition called Printing the Revolution, and it featured Chicano graphics from 1965 to now. And there was a large exhibition that's still traveling, and there was a large exhibition catalog. And Chicano art history lives in catalogs. It's very hard to find monographs or books specifically related to one artist, or just general art history books. When you're thinking of Van Gogh, there's 40 books. When you're thinking about Chicano art, they live in booklets, they live in exhibition catalogs. There's very few, and they're, again, 20 or 10 years apart. And there was a real desire for this exhibition initially to not have a catalog. And I very much pushed for that to exist because so much of what I encountered throughout my upbringing as an academic, through the MA and the PhD, was someone always telling me, Chicano art is dead. Chicanos are dead. No one uses that. And it's very hard to be from San Antonio and hear that. And it's very hard to be online and understand the technological references to these titles and to this vernacular. People are still using that. Young people are still using that. So it's a multi-generational application, and artists are still identifying as that. So this constant erasure throughout my training, through other curators, board members, institutions, everybody was saying Chicano art is dead, Chicano art is less than. And so with this publication through Princeton University Press, and it's a very large book, it's like a murder weapon book, it's gigantic, but it's this example of saying, no, we exist, there are many of us, there are many generations of us, this artwork is very good, and there's no contesting that. This is part of the American story, this is part of art history, and we're recognizing that this large federal institution is defining this history and demanding that we recognize these Chicano artists that contributed to this. So just making sure people aren't erased and forgotten. Unfortunately, several printmakers have already passed. Major master printmakers like Sam Coronado out of Austin, for example, they didn't get to see their artwork hung in the Smithsonian in DC or see themselves in this catalog, but their families did. So with that catalog, their legacies continue, and we're in multiple libraries all over the world. It is a major catalog that's in every print center. It's taught in schools. It's in all the syllabus at all levels, undergrad, graduate, PhD, and it's completely redefining people's notion of what printmaking looks like, and that Chicano art is not that. It's still very much in existence.
Agreed.
So the idea of, okay, when have I felt like I was able to sort of bridge civil rights and the work that I'm doing? I remember several years ago, I was working at an institution, and I was working on a project about Latino art. And I wanted to have a section of the exhibition that was about Resquachismo. And my colleagues were skeptical. Some of them, yeah, that sounds interesting, explain it. None of them had ever heard the term before. No one could even pronounce it. And so that gives you a sense of some of the demographics I was working with. And ultimately, there were some executive decisions made, and that project ended up looking very different, and it did not include a reference to Resquachismo in the way that I had hoped. I also, at that time, was strongly advocating for bilingual labels. I felt like we needed to have Spanish and English. This was when I was working in Chicago. Chicago has a population of Latinos. It's 1 million people. So I thought, if we really want to be inclusive, we should have things in 2 languages, at least. So fast forward to the present day. I'm in a very different institution, very different position. First of all, the McNay has been doing bilingual labels for years for all exhibitions, not just the ones that are Latino art, throughout the entire museum, including the permanent collection, which is really important. And I am really proud to say, I think that moment for me is coming up. This winter, I'm organizing an exhibition looking at collection work as well as some contemporary works from around San Antonio in the US that's called Resquachismo, 35 Years of a Chicano Aesthetic. So
Yes,
I'm
sir.
very excited. Looking at the picture of Tomas over there and excited to be in conversation with him throughout this project too. So yes, it's constant work. You cannot get discouraged because for every no, you'll find a yes.
Oh, that's incredible. Right on. I think for us, we started something called the Barrio Stories Project back in 2015. And that was as a response to the gentrification of the historic barrios, starting with the oldest barrio, which is gone now because they built the Tucson Convention Center over it during urban renewal in the late 60s, as was the case in many cities around the country. And so the point of that project was to sort of bring back the people and the places and the stories that used to exist where the convention center currently is. And we did that through oral history collection primarily. But we taught a class at the community college for high school students to get college credit to teach them how to be ethnographers. And they were the ones that actually did all the interviews with the elders. So we did a lot of cross-sector partnerships with educational institutions, with heritage preservation, historical society, and different groups. And we did just that. We created 13 little mini stages, and we had about 50 community actors of all ages, and we brought the memories back to life. As you walk through the convention center, you would just run into all these memories told through theater. And that was very successful. It was in 2016. And then from that, we were able to do 3 more. We did one in Barrio Anita, we did one in Nogales, right on the border, and then most recently on the west side in Barrio Hollywood and Menlo Park. And like, for example, when we did the Barrio Anita one, as a result of that, the neighborhood association that had been defunct for about 8 years was reestablished a couple months later. The public pool that was in that neighborhood that was closed since the recession was reopened. All this like communication between the city council person and that neighborhood like increased. So we saw like really tangible impacts that led to like a better life, right, for these folks. And Jill, just to bring it round full circle, just last year at the convention center, the plaza, there's several buildings, and then there's big plazas in the middle of all that. And that was renamed the Alvatores Plaza as a result of that first a sort of seed that was sparked in some community members when we did the first Barrio Stories there. And now Borderlands was contracted through Rio Nuevo, which is a state-funded redevelopment agency, to create an augmented reality culture walk throughout the convention center that with your phone, you'll be able to see where the old streets were. Certain buildings and tienditas and things will be like 3D rendered. You can walk around them. You can even maybe walk inside them, I'm told. And all these oral history snippets will be playing the audio of that. And that's like 24/7. That will always be available. And so that's sort of where things have come from, all that. And like Claudia was saying, you know, at this level, we're charging a lot of money, you know, like to do all this research, to turn over all these artifacts to them. So I'd say that's my proudest achievement.
Well, congratulations to all 3 of you, yes. A round of applause again for Claudia Zapata, Mia Lopez, and Mr. Pinate over here. Great conversation. This is really, truly wonderful. I want to thank MACRI for hosting us, and this particular topic, I thought it was incredibly insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.